All right, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another Unpimple Med video. My name is Nate, and today I want to talk a little bit about study strategies that I found effective as I was going through medical school. I know that this may be a little bit off topic as far as what I mentioned in the introduction, being like that transition between didactic learning to clinical medicine, but you will also use a lot of study strategies in order to crush your Step 2 exam, pass Step 1, and even as you're like reviewing evidence-based medicine journals and things like that, you'll be able to use these strategies to have long-term retention for large amounts of information. I think we all kind of know the phrase of like drinking out of a fire hose is equivalent to being in medical school as far as the level of information and the speed at which the information comes to you. And that's definitely true. But I think with these study strategies that I'm going to discuss in this video today, you will have the ability, if you get really good at them, to not only feel like you have everything under control and that you understand things really well, but you might even be able to get ahead and be able to kind of make time for yourself to do things outside of school because you're so effective at studying. And that's kind of the goal, right? And I talked a little bit about that in the last video where we talked about goal setting and mentality shifts that you can use in order to be really well-rounded as a medical student and hopefully as a doctor in the future. So let's dive right into it. Here's a couple of study strategies that I think were super effective for me as I was studying for boards and medical school exams, etc. So the first one I want to talk about is active retrieval. So, what is active retrieval? Active retrieval is the process of actively engaging with the material. And that looks different for a lot of people, but I'll kind of give you an example of how I use active retrieval in my studying. So, a typical day for me, especially when I was learning stuff for step two, would be, get up, go to the gym, come home, start studying, and I would initially take my iPad, and if I was learning, let's say I'm learning about pathophysiology of whatever, neurologic diseases or something like that, and I would take my iPad and I have my notes on there, and I'd go through and I would choose, one or two diseases at a time that I would read through the pathophysiology, what goes wrong, how do we work it up, how do we treat it, and I would do that for each disease. And I would take notes and make sure that I understood it really well. And then I would put my notes away. And the active retrieval process for me was out loud. I would say to myself, here's everything that I know about migraines. Here's everything I know about cluster headaches. Here's everything I know about strokes. And I would say it out loud. I would see how much of it I knew from memory without looking at my notes. And then I would pull my notes back out after doing that. And anything that I missed, I would highlight in red. And I think that's an important process. So highlighting the things that you got wrong are going to be the things that you're going to emphasize the next time you talk about those diseases out loud, right? It sticks out in your brain like, oh, I missed that. We have to give whatever tryptophan for migraine headaches, and really kind of focusing in on the things that you missed. So that for me was the active retrieval process. Another way of actively engaging with material is practice questions. So UWorld is going to be like your number one thing that you go to for your practice questions. I felt that when I was going through step two, the actual exam itself, I felt like I was just taking UWorld blocks. So if you get really good at taking UWorld and understanding the red herrings that they throw in there and the clues that they give you in order to get you to the right answer, those things can help. So two things for active retrieval or actively engaging with the material is saying stuff out loud to yourself or at least reviewing stuff in your head without looking at your notes instead of just passively reading through things. I think that's a common mistake that a lot of people do, and it's something that I did a lot when I was first taking the MCAT. I think I spoke about this in the last video a little bit. First time I took the MCAT, I got a 500. Second time I took it, I got a 514. And a large part of why I think I was successful the second time around was because I challenged myself a lot. And the act of challenging yourself to learn material without notes is going to solidify things in your brain and synthesize things in your brain a lot better than you just staring at your notes over and over and over again. And I think that's kind of the key ultimately to being an effective learner is to be able to, in your own mind, pull things out when you're prompted regarding every disease, every physiologic process, every pharmacology, mechanism of action, et cetera, et cetera. If you can do that from memory, then obviously you're going to be able to do that freely recall things on an exam, right? So first thing, active retrieval, very important. Honestly, kind of the foundation of learning. And yes, it's hard. And yes, you're going to get burnt out on doing it because it's challenging and you're making your brain work and you're forming synapses that you wouldn't have otherwise made if you're just passively reading through something. But it's absolutely essential in order to synthesize large amounts of information. And there's lots of studies about it. There's a big study that came out in 2006 that highlighted how effective a lot of these study strategies that I'm going to discuss is. So if you don't believe me, you can go check that out. Second study strategy, spaced repetition. I'm sure a lot of people already know this, but spaced repetition is essentially where you view something one day and then you go and you visit it like temporally in space a different time. So like I study on Monday neurologic diseases, and then I go and do cardiovascular diseases the second day, and then the third day I do neuro diseases again, right? Spaced repetition. You see things multiple times over multiple courses of weeks, etc. And that's effective because you don't get bogged down in all of the details the first time. You might get bogged down the first time you read everything, but as you start to do spaced repetition and you see something again in the future, you're going to get less and less bogged down each time you learn it. And it becomes easier to recall it. It becomes easier to engage with the material the more times you see it. That's why Anki, for example, is super effective. Now, personally, I only ever used Anki in graduate school for anatomy. In medical school, I never used Anki. Like I said, would just do active retrieval, and that was like my main form of studying and how I engage with the material. And then another thing, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is like elaboration and self-explanation, which I'll talk about in a second. But those were like my main things. But space repetition for me wasn't Anki. My space repetition was just first day, like I said, I'll view these four diseases, and then the second day I move on to something else. I learn the pharmacology associated with those diseases or whatever it might be, and then I go back and relearn the diseases from Monday. And just having that kind of spaced repetition using these other study strategies was effective for me. So definitely give that a shot. I think that's another important thing. You can't just look at something once, engage with the material once, and expect to learn it. You have to see it multiple times before the exam. So, for example, like if I had 2 weeks to study for a cardiovascular exam, and I had to learn obviously all the EKGs, the basics essentially. You have to learn, myocardial infarction, heart failure, goal-directed medical therapy, et cetera, et cetera. I would see all of those topics at least five, maybe six times before I would even get to the exam. And I'll talk a little bit about how my study strategy changes right before an exam, but we'll get there in a second. So, space repetition, active retrieval, two very important pieces. Now, the next piece I'll talk about is elaboration and self-explanation. So, these study strategies are essentially you synthesize all this information with your active retrieval. You've seen it multiple times. And so right before an exam, usually 3 days, maybe 4 days before an exam, what I would do, we had a group of people that I studied with. Shout out Jake, shout out Kyle. We used to sit down at a table and we would quiz each other. And essentially I would say, okay, tell me everything you know about myocardial infarctions. What's the first line treatment? And what's the, first most important test to order? And we would just kind of talk about it. And as the person is talking, if there was any gaps in their understanding or if there was a problem with the way that they were approaching the material, we would call them out and say, well, this is the way that I think about it. And that is a form of elaboration. You elaborating on what you know and what you've learned on your own to somebody else is very important to solidify things. And also people can kind of identify where there might be issues in your line of thinking. And then the self-explanation part is essentially the way that I think about self-explanation is explain things to yourself as if you were describing it to a 5-year-old. Make it as simple as possible without missing any of the steps. Like if you're going through a biochemical process, obviously you have to use the words associated with that biochemical process as far as like the substrates and stuff like that. But understand like in very basic terms, we start with this thing, it turns into this thing, and that's needed for this process, and keep it very basic. And you should be able to, when you're self-explaining like that, go into an elementary school class and they would be able to understand what you're talking about. So keep it very simple, very brief, but you're hitting all of the processes. That can help you with problem solving and critical thinking as you get approached with something very complicated on an exam. If you take a step back and say, okay, well, actually, this is very simple. The basis of this process is X, Y, and Z, and I know that because I've done my self-explanation prior to this exam. They're trying to make it all complicated with all these, more, advanced terminologies, et cetera, but you know how to simplify it, and that can help you with anxiety and critical thinking and things like that. So those are kind of like the basic study strategies that I've used that have been very effective going through medical school and helped me really synthesize large amounts of information very effectively. The last piece that I want to talk about is the idea of chunking or taking bits of information at a time. I think there's this pressure a lot of the time when you're going through medical school, especially when you first start, like first year, you're learning all this anatomy, physiology, pharmacology. It's just like all getting thrown at you all at once, and it can be very overwhelming. And I think a lot of people feel this pressure to learn it all at once and learn it as fast as they can, and so they don't take the time to truly understand the important processes or the important details behind each thing. So when they get asked a question that's maybe second order, third order question, they can't reason through it because they haven't taken the time to really dive into those processes because they're trying to take it all in at once. And these study strategies in addition to chunking are really going to help you. So chunking is the idea of you have all this information, a huge tub of information, right? You decide one day I want to take this chunk of information and really understand everything about it. So I'll give anatomy as an example because I think that's an easy one to understand how chunking works. So anatomy is hard for a lot of people because not only are you learning new names, which are all like Latin names, very hard to understand, you have to learn the spatial relationships of those muscles, bones, blah, 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 to each other. You have to learn the blood supply, you have to learn the innervation, you have to learn the function of the organ, you have to learn the action of the muscle, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of different pieces, right? So chunking is the idea like, okay, it's Monday. I have 2 weeks to study for this exam. On Monday, I'm going to learn the pectoral muscle names, their spatial relationships to each other. I'm going to learn the humeral muscles, the blood supply generally to this area. I'm going to learn the innervation generally to this area. And you take it in small chunks, however that looks like for you. If you want to do all the names first, you want to learn the entire upper limb names, you can do it that way. If you want to learn all of the innervation first, you can do it that way. The way that I did it was by region. So I would say, because it just makes sense, right? Like stuff in the same region is going to have relatively the same blood supply. It's going to have similar named nerves, et cetera, right? So I tried to chunk it in the sense that like for anatomy especially, like okay, I want to do pectoral muscles, I want to do shoulder, and I want to do stuff attached to the humerus first. I'm going to start there and I'm going to learn everything I need to know about that. And then the second day, right, you go, okay, well, I learned all this stuff yesterday, let me go back, I'm going to learn as much as I can about this stuff again, try to review it as much as I can with that active retrieval, and then I'm going to learn a little bit more. I'm going to go down, I'm going to do some of the forearm muscles and innervation and the spatial relationships here, and then the third day you do it all again and you just kind of build off of that, right? That's the idea of chunking. And I think when you chop it up into those more kind of smaller bits, more digestible bits, it makes it so much less overwhelming. And you'll be surprised how fast you pick it up. If you review each thing that you learned the previous day, even for like an hour out of your study day, the information and the free recall that you gain from that process is exponential. By the time you get to, your 2 weeks is up and you're at the exam, you've now reviewed everything, like I said, 5 or 6 times at least, right? So those are some of the things that I was thinking about. I hope that helps. If you have any additional study strategies that you used, please leave it in the comments. We can talk about it. If you have any questions, let me know. we'll do a kind of a separate video at some point about kind of resources to use for board exams and things outside of like the traditional curriculum that you can use in order to help you learn. I do have some resources. I like to keep it very simple. Like I said, I didn't use Anki. I tried to minimize the amount of resources that I used. I felt like there was so many resources out there that you have to find something that works for you and just stick to it. You're really good at using it. Same idea applies to these study strategies. Find something that works, stick to it. You're really good at it. You can be effective, and you can also make more time for yourself to do things that you really enjoy outside of school and medicine. So let me know what you think, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.